she said, you want to roller skate? And I said, no, I don't want to roller skate. She said, you want to act? And I said, no. And she said, well, what do you mean? And I said, I don't know. I just one day want to be involved in something like that. And so I guess I meant I wanted to produce, there you have it. It's as good a description of what we do as any, right?
I want to be a producer with a hit show on Broadway.
You're listening to the Producer's Perspective Podcast with your host, Tony Award winner, Ken Davenport.
It's like rain on your wedding day. It's a free ride when you've already paid.
Hey everybody, it's Ken Davenport, and that was a song from Jagged Little Pill. You've probably heard it before because it's like a #1 hit, especially if you grew up in the 90s. Today we're going to talk to the lead producer of Jagged Little Pill, Vivek Tiwary. Wait to hear the story of how he got these rights from Alanis Morissette. It is one that you are going to learn from and love. So let's get to it. Here is Vivek. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Producer's Perspective Podcast. I'm super excited to talk to today's guest. You missed actually the offline conversation we were having about food right before this, but we'll save that for another podcast. But if that's any indication, today is going to be a fantastic discussion. He is the lead producer of Jagged Little Pill. Please welcome to the podcast, Vivek Tiwary. Welcome, Vivek.
Thank you so much for having me.
So Vivek has something that most Broadway producers don't have. You're one of the rare and the few that actually have an MBA and have studied business. We're going to talk about that. In addition to Jagged, he's been a producer on American Idiot, Raisin in the Sun, and The Addams Family. And get this, he's the author of a New York Times best-selling graphic novel called The Fifth Beatle, correct?
I am indeed, yeah. So I brought a copy for you, actually.
Oh my God, will you sign it for me?
Oh, sure,
Fantastic.
if you'd like. That's very kind of you.
He's got an MBA and he is a best-selling New York Times author. Those are two things that most Broadway producers do not have. So you have this very interesting path to becoming a producer. So where did the love of theater start?
The most basic answer to that question from my upbringing and my geography, from my parents and New York City. I was born here in the city. My parents didn't work in the arts. They were immigrants. The family is originally from India, but they loved the arts. My dad was a doctor. My mom was an attorney. So literally no professional connection to the arts. But they loved all forms of art. And ever since I was a little kid, we grew up on 12th Street. They were taking me uptown to see Broadway shows and ballet and the opera. And I grew up loving the fine performing arts, if you will. And then as soon as I was allowed out of the house on my own in my teenage years, I was going downtown to places like CBGB's and La Mama and seeing, experimental theater, as it was called back then, and, early punk rock shows and early Sonic Youth shows. And, so I grew up with a very, very well-rounded love of all forms of the arts, but certainly a very sweet spot for Broadway. My mom was a gigantic Broadway fan, and I saw all the shows growing up. And a quick story, I distinctly remember, walking out of Starlight Express. It was Starlight Express, and telling my mom, one day I want to do that. And she said, you want to roller skate? Yeah, for those of you who don't know Starlight Express, it's an Andrew Lloyd Webber musical that in large part takes place on roller skates. And I said, no, I don't want to roller skate. She said, you want to act? And I said, no. And she said, well, what do you mean? And I said, I don't know. I just one day want to be involved in something like that. And so I guess I meant I wanted to produce, there you have it. It's as good a description of what we do as any, right?
Starlight Express.
But it was Starlight Express. I have to give Sir Andrew his credit, and it was Cats before that, if I'm honest, was the gateway drug. I remember seeing Cats and seeing, back then, that was immersive theater, seeing those cats crawling out of the walls and up the alley. And I mean, there was nothing like that I had seen back then. It was an early form of immersive theater, I think. And I remember walking out of that show and having my mind blown.
Yeah, Andrew has this thing about actually Starlight Express and Cats are both perfect examples. Like everything he does has some very unique quality to it, which I think is not only a good thing for theater, but just business in general. So being the son of an Indian doctor myself, an Indian immigrant doctor, how did that conversation go when you said, I want to get involved in the theater? Obviously, you didn't start that right away, but were they like, no, you're going right to med school?
To give my parents their due credit, they were pretty supportive. Being honest, they were a lot better than many other Indian parents. I have a lot of, family members and Indian friends and colleagues whose parents were not so understanding with passions that they may have had. Some who did not quote unquote allow them to pursue those passions. And my family, my parents Unfortunately, they passed away. My dad passed away while I was in college, and my mom passed away about after I graduated from Wharton. I took a job working at Mercury Records, and my mom passed away about a year into that job. So they didn't actually get to see me doing the things that I'm doing now. However, as I'm sure we'll talk about my career path, my path started in the music industry. As I just mentioned, I was working for record labels. And, that's where my dream was to really work broadly in the arts, music, graphic novels, comics, theater, do a little bit of everything. And I'm proud to say I am living that dream. But I wanted to start with music. Music in many ways was my first love. Even, going back to those Broadway shows that my mom took me to, the ones that really spoke to me were the musicals. And so, while I was in college and business school, I was certainly telling them that, that I wanted to pursue a career in the music industry, that's where I wanted to start. Starting my own company was always my end goal, but I viewed working for a record label as an extension of my education. And they knew that was a path that I was on. While I was at Wharton, I got a job working for Sony Music as a field marketing rep. So I worked out of my dorm room, but I was working for Sony Distribution. So they saw me make that start. And then my mom certainly saw me take a job at Mercury Records. And like all good parents, they were nervous about that career choice, and they were right to be. Those are music and the arts, as are difficult fields. They're ones you have to remain passionate about. And yes, you can make money and have a stable life, but it takes a lot of persistence to get there. And there are certainly more stable and lucrative paths, especially for someone with a business degree. So I would say that they gave me a very, very healthy amount of skepticism, and they forced me to ask the right questions and to make sure that this was something I was passionate about and willing to be persistent on. So I wouldn't say that they just said, go for it. They would have, I think, preferred that I didn't. But God bless them. They made me, confront the hard parts of that decision. And then once they saw that I was real about it, they didn't stop me, and they were as supportive as they could be.
And I made a joke about it in the introduction in terms of the MBA, but was there ever a decision, will I or won't I? I mean, a lot of people in this business side of the arts don't have that kind of education.
Yeah.
Were you like, oh, I want this, or?
Yeah. So I should give a little point of fact correction. It's not actually an MBA. I did the dual degree program at Wharton as an undergrad. They don't actually have this program anymore, but back then I literally applied into both schools. Now they have a program. I don't know what MNT is Management and Technology, which is you attend Wharton and the engineering school. And there is a dual degree program that allows you to pursue liberal arts and Wharton. But when I was there, I literally had to apply to both the College of Arts and Sciences and the Wharton School of Business. So as an undergrad, I was on a 5-year plan, attending both schools, going through summers, and for 5 years, as I said.
It's harder than an MBA, just for the record. Just so I was wrong, but it's actually harder.
Look, I certainly don't want to say that it's harder than an MBA. I have a lot of respect for people who go through that process. However, for what it's worth, Wharton actually does not like to take their people who do that undergraduate program into their MBA program because they say there is so much overlap. So they actually don't, they suggest that if you go through that and you want to pursue an MBA really for the letters, to have them on your CV, they actually recommend you go to another business school to get a different perspective because you really do learn the MBA program there. And knowing that I wanted to go into the entertainment industries, I didn't feel that the letters were necessary. So I didn't go on to do the MBA program. But your question is still valid. It was still a very challenging path. And actually, when I started just at Wharton. As I graduated high school, like many high school kids, I didn't know what I wanted to do with my future. I knew that I didn't want to be a doctor or an engineer, which were the traditional paths that were expected of me as a young Indian kid with a father who was a doctor. And, my if I wasn't going to do either of those things, then I was expected to join my family business. And my family business does a variety of different things, very well diversified, started by my grandfather. We can talk about that separately. It is quite fascinating. The core competencies are agriculture, food products, and finance. But they also have automotive. They do a really ton of really interesting things, but nothing in entertainment. So nothing that I was passionate about. Nevertheless, that was the path that I started to follow. I knew that I didn't want to be a doctor or an engineer, so I guess I'm going to join the family business. So I guess I should get a business background. And I remember, at Wharton being really torn. I felt that on one hand, I was worried about finding a path to pursue my passions and do something in the arts and letting my family down. And then on another hand, I was torn about not wanting to, because I loved my family, like not let them down, but then sell my passions out. So I didn't really know what to do. So I tried to do them both, and be in business school. And then I applied into the College of Arts and Sciences because I also cared about liberal arts. And I found myself a job working in the music industry. And I thought I was going to do both and see where it took me. And I loved working in the music industry and was, I guess, promising in that space. And my parents saw at that point that I was serious, that this wasn't a passing fad. I played drums and percussion in a band in high school, and I think they wanted to make sure this wasn't going to be like that, just another thing that I was into for a couple of years. But as soon as they saw that I was serious about it, they actually encouraged me to keep chasing that passion. So that's kind of the path of it,
And what is something you learned from business school and that education that you find yourself applying to today, to producing a show that some of us who haven't had that education, like this guy talking right now, may not have? So what's something that you use every day from that?
Oh man, I mean,
world?
I literally, running my own company, I use my business background every single day. Everything that I do is informed by the business education that I had. One thing you learn in business school is did they say discuss it while you're in love? That negotiate all the tough things when everybody is at the beginning of a process and everyone's passionate about the art and the project, as opposed to when things are moving and people might have shifted and feel more entitled in certain ways and before jealousies kick in. And I think that's a really good piece of advice. Get it on paper, but negotiate it at the very beginning when everybody's in love. Certainly passion and persistence I learned from in business school. If you in entrepreneurial management class, they say that I was at business school in the early 90s. I graduated in 96. So this was before the internet boom and before you saw people who, would work on something and have a relative overnight success, a great idea that took off and had a gigantic IPO. You heard a lot of those stories after I graduated. But in my sort of era, it was you got to work 5 to 10 years building your company before you should expect to have any real sense of profit, and a lot of business people aren't into that. So they instead you take a job working for a firm, or go into finance, go into investment banking, go in actuarial science, a number of other fields. But if you want to do entrepreneurial management, I learned at school that's going to take you a good 5 to 10 years before you're going to see any profits, and be prepared to rough it for those first 5 to 10 years. And that's as good of advice as any into building a show for Broadway or building a musical, certainly. Any sort of new musical, non-revival, you're going to take at least 5 years to get it off the ground. So to know that you're going to be working for 5+ years and not really seeing any money from it, in fact, losing money, and to be able to, in your head, know that is not only okay, but that's normal, and not beat yourself up about that. That's something I learned in business school.
And when you started looking at the financial reporting that Broadway does, or the forecasting or the modeling or the budgets, did it drive you crazy coming from business school?
It's so funny. It's one of the things I actually love about Broadway is that it's straightforward in the sense that your show is performing in a theater. The theater has X number of seats. Your deal with the theater is this deal, and you can kind of figure out what that all means. And of course, as producers, it's part of our job to play with that, to have premium seating and to have sponsorships and to, offer some tickets, at group discounts and TDF. And there's a million different things you can do to change those numbers and change how that spreadsheet looks. But the basic accounting is pretty straightforward. What you can't do is change the number of seats, more or less. I mean, as you know, there's certain wiggle room and add a few seats or take a few seats here for sight lines and whatnot. But for the most part, the theater has a certain capacity, unlike a film where you can go wide if the film is doing well or narrow it down if the film's not doing so well. In the record business, if you're selling CDs, you have distribution. You try to get it into more and more stores. You try to launch it internationally. On Broadway, you have yes, eventually you'll have a tour and you'll have international productions. But the accounting for me was refreshing. It was very easy to wrap your head around this. You knew more or less when you were going to break even if you sold more or less this percentage of the house. That you can't really argue with. And I loved that. I thought there was a certain degree of certainty to that you could plan around.
That's a very good point, because I look at business models for other industries and these projections are always like, oh, our app is going to sell 8 million. And it's like,
exactly
what are you
right.
basing this on?
That's exactly
it's
right.
based on this algorithm, which we know is mostly BS. So that's a fascinating approach. So you co-produced before you became a lead producer.
Yeah.
What was the thing that made you go, okay, I'm ready to be the CEO of a big musical and I'm ready to graduate?
That's a really good question. I think mostly, as with everything, I lead from a place of passion. And it was more just I had a passionate idea that was mine, that I had an ability to get off the ground. I mean, actually, to give full credit where it's due, one of my producing partners on Jagged Little Pill, Arvin David, he said to me over a tea that we were having, he said, I always thought Jagged Little Pill would make a great musical. So to give credit, it was really his spark of an idea. But I went home that night, listened to the record, and agreed with him. And Arvin at the time was mostly doing television. I joke like in The Godfather, we sucked him back into theater. He had done theater in the UK and had moved actually to LA to really focus on TV. And, I called him back and I said, I listened to that record. I hadn't listened to it from beginning to end since I was listening to it when it came out. Of course, I had heard the hits on the radio, but I hadn't listened to it as a complete piece of work, and God only knows how, a decade plus, And I was certainly the first time I had listened to it with musical theater ears, if you will. And I remembered being struck by how musical theater the songs felt. That album, the songs are epic in their vibe, in their feel, the way a U2 song is epic. They're very big. But unlike U2, who I love, so this is not a critique, but like the U2 songs are also epic in their message. Where the streets have no name and I still haven't found what I'm looking for. Whereas the Alanis songs, their message is very small. It's like, here's what happened to me one summer. Here's what happened in a relationship I was involved in. Here's what happened one day when I broke into your house. It's like very tiny, very personal messages. And to me, that's almost the definition of a great musical theater song. It's a song that plays to the back of the audience, but makes you feel like you're right inside one person's head. And I also saw not a story. It's not a rock opera the way American Idiot is a rock opera with a sort of built-in story. But I found thematic narrative in the album. And I thought, this is ready. This is there. And I was very proud of my work on American Idiot. And that show is very loud in terms of its message. I don't mean just the music. And it's very male. Certainly there are wonderful female characters in it, but it's a very male point of view in as it's written by Green Day. And I knew that the next thing I wanted to do, I wanted to lean into my music background. All my projects lean into my music background. It's my first love, as I said. But I wanted to do something that was a little bit more female focused and a little bit quieter in terms of its message. The music in Jagged is still very rock, but the message it's no disrespect on American Idiot, but a little more nuanced, a little quieter, I think, a little less aggressive than the messages of that show. And so this just felt like something I wanted to do. And at this point I had, I don't want to sound like I'm patting myself on the back too much, but a pretty good reputation and pretty good network within the music industry. And while I didn't know Alanis's then manager directly, we were 1 degree of separation. So I met with her then manager. We hit it off and she said, Alanis is going to love you. You should meet with her next time you go out to LA. And I'll stop there, but so the ball had started rolling of my own volition, so I kind of, to some degree, fell into it in the sense that it was the next idea I discovered that I was passionate about, and I was the one that had set it in motion. So obviously I was going to be the lead producer on it. That being said, there was a part of me that had felt that it was time to drive the bus. I had wonderful experiences being a co-producer on other shows, and I joined those shows because I was passionate about them, but the idea didn't come from me and the process had already been in motion. And I sort of felt like it's time for me to set an idea in motion and it's time for me to drive the bus. So even if I hadn't come across the path that led me to sitting down to have lunch with Alanis, I think I would have looked for it. I think I was out there feeling like I don't want to be another co-producer this time around.
And if you could look back at that moment, because getting the rights to this music is something that I'm sure a lot of people thought about and dismissed because I'll never get those rights. I'll never do that. I'll never do that. And here you come along and yes, you've got some connections in the music industry and you've co-produced a few shows, but you've never led one. Certainly there are Broadway producers with a lot more credits, right? Is there anything that you remember doing or saying that made her go oh, this is the guy I'm going to entrust the biggest thing I've ever done in my life? and her art to you? Why you?
Well, look, I mean, we had a really great meeting, that first meeting, and I will say that why me? I mean, you'd have to ask her, but I will tell you that I think I'm very unique. Again, not wanting to sound like I'm patting myself on the back, but very unique in the world of Broadway producing, in that I come out of the music industry, not just like I like these bands and I grew up with these albums, but I worked in the music industry for a number of years. I worked for a small record label called Seed Records. I then worked for Atlantic Records. I then worked for Sony Music Distribution, as I mentioned earlier. I then worked for Mercury Records. Like that's the industry that I really grew up in, was the music industry. And I speak that language and I understand that business. And that business is as bizarre and unique as our Broadway business. It's very, very different. It operates on different time frames. It operates with different financial models, different financial expectations for projects. Everything about it is different, and I understand it, and I speak that language. And I'm also wicked passionate about music, so I understand artists, and I understand legacy. I understand what it means to protect a piece of IP. A lot of Broadway producers, I noticed, when going after IP, have kind of the attitude that you should secure the IP and endear yourself to the owner or the creator of the IP, and then keep them as far away as possible, because they can only be trouble, assuming they're not theater people themselves. It's like if it comes from a film or whatever. And I'm the exact opposite. I'm like, when I sit down with somebody, I'm like, I want you involved in this IP. I remember telling her, if, this record is, really old and you were a kid when you made it, if you feel like you don't want to revisit it, that would be perfectly understandable. But I don't want to do it if you don't want to do it. Like, half of this for me is being able to work with you, partially because I think she's a genius, and partially because, that's half the fun for me, right? I love what I do. I want to work with some of my heroes. And I think that's very unusual, that sort of collaborative nature and the ability to speak both languages, to sit down with her and for her to feel that I understand her, both artistically as well as the business that she operates in. And I have felt that with a number of other musicians that I've sat down with. I just know that that's a different meeting than the type of meeting they would take with any Broadway producer, even one that has had technically far more experience producing more shows than I have, because they've not worked in the music industry. Very specific to Alanis, and she has said this very publicly, that I was not the first producer to sit down with her and suggest that they do something with Jagged Little Pill, but I was the first producer to sit down with her and say, right off the bat, it was one of the first things I said, like, I don't want to tell your life story with it. Like, I don't want to use Jagged Little Pill to do a biopiece. I don't want it to be a thinly veiled biography. There will be no character in our ensemble who is a female singer-songwriter who's kind of like Alanis. Like, I wasn't interested in that at all. And I'll never say never. Maybe I'll do one of those projects, but they don't interest me. That's not what I do. Another thing that I think is really special about what I do, again, I really don't want to sound like I'm being arrogant about this, but this is kind of what I do, is that I come up with, daring combinations. Literally in that first meeting, I also said to her that I want to tell a story that is not a 90s period piece. Telling a 90s period piece that is about you could be a really cool Jagged musical that I would go to, but that's not what I'm interested in doing. It's not what I do. I want to tell a piece that's set in the present day, that deals with issues of the present day, important issues in the zeitgeist, that forces the audience to confront uncomfortable truths to the world around them, and has the audience realize that by leaning on their community and leaning on your loved ones, you can get yourself to a place of empowerment and hope, and you can come out the other end. You live, you learn, coming out the other end wiser and stronger by leaning on the people you love. Like, that's to me the legacy of the album. That's what the album did for me, and that's what I think it did for people who love that record. It helped them through difficult times and made them realize that you were not alone, and that by leaning on the people who understood you, you could empower yourself and find hope and eventually find healing. That's what the album did. So I was like, that's the story I want to tell.
In the first meeting, you told her, this is the approach I want.
I didn't know the narrative, but I knew that theme. I knew that basic story. I don't know what world we set that story in, but I said that. And then I also said, and I know that doesn't necessarily sound like a fun night at the theater, so it also needs to be funny. Right? And we may need to look outside the box of traditional theater writers for that. For example, someone like Diablo Cody. And that's what Diablo Cody does, right? She tells stories that are very serious in their issues, but are funny. She's a comedian. She writes comedies. But Juno is about teen pregnancy, and it's funny. United States of Terror is about mental illness, but it's funny. This is what Diablo does. And yeah, that was my pitch to her.
It's a risky
and she loved it. And it is risky.
Yeah,
it is,
'cause they may say, no,
the easy
you
thing
want
to do
this-
would be to convince her she's lived an inspiring life and let's do your bio. And she has lived an inspiring life, but that's not what I do. And that's not what I'm interested in. And now when you put it out into the world, Diablo Cody collaborating with Alanis Morissette and Diane Paulus and Tom Kitt and Sidney Larby, like that makes a lot of sense. But no one was coming to those people suggesting that. Diablo Cody told me I was the first person that ever approached her about a stage musical, and to me, she is a very collaborative. She comes from a television writer's room mentality. It's collaborative by nature. She's very funny, her dialogue is often very witty one-liners, which you need in theater. You need a one line to draw somebody into the story, and you need to be nuanced. You need to be both funny and serious. I mean, she's a perfect theatrical writer, I thought. And I think artists also like that I do that. Musical artists know that if they're sitting down with me, they're immediately getting passion, because I don't sit down with anybody unless I'm passionate about it. So they get that right away. They get somebody who understands the business, who will protect the legacy of their album, their catalog, something that's very meaningful for them as a piece of art, because I'm a music geek. And thirdly, I'm going to come up with something creative. I'm not just going to sit down and say, let's tell your life story. You've lived an inspiring life. I'm going to have some out-of-the-box crazy idea. And they're artists. They want an out-of-the-box interesting idea.
I wish I had IP myself to give you. I mean, this is it's a fascinating. It's true. And you're now a lead producer on Broadway, and it's a big hit. And congratulations, because all the development has proven, and all that passion is certainly it's paid its way. It's doing very, very well, critically as well as financially at the box office. What's the one thing about lead producing a big Broadway musical that has surprised you the most? That you were like, I didn't expect that when I got here.
I'll think about that a little bit longer, but I'm really not being disingenuous by saying there hasn't really been any of those kind of surprises. I mean, there's obviously surprises along the way in terms of the work. The work never, there's always surprise. I mean, it's live theater, it's drama by definition. But I don't think there have been any surprises, and you pointed out really wisely that I've been co-producer on a number of shows, and co-producer meaning like the second or third listed producer, which might have mean I'm not the lead, I'm not the number one, I'm not the guy or gal that like set it all in motion, but I was there from the very beginning, and I did see every aspect of the process, and I really learned from that process. Steve Baruch, who produces regularly on Broadway, he let me into the producers. It was the first show I was involved in. I don't think he really appreciates this, but he really was my first mentor in the industry.
Shame that didn't work out too well there. It's a real shame.
That's, and it was a great, and I remember telling him like, I'll put a little bit of my own money in and I'll raise some money. So I'll earn my place. But, I really want to learn. Will you let me trail you? Will you let me take you out to breakfast once a week and fill me in on what happened in that meeting that I know I was too junior to be allowed to come to, but I knew it was happening and I want to know, I want to learn. So as a result of all that learning, I think by the time I got to lead producing, there were no surprises in the role of lead producing, but certainly a lot of surprises along the way, as there always are,
So you mentioned raising money there. So what's your strategy when you raise money as a co-producer, as a lead producer? Where do you start? What's your pitch? Any tips?
Yeah, for me, when I started, so I started raising money as a producer, obviously from way back with the producers, right? And so, 20 plus years ago. And I had come out of business school. And so I, at least at the time, it seemed to me that I was very unusual in my pitch as a producer, in that I approached people both from a business perspective and from a passion perspective. I mean, I remember at the time hearing a producer pitch someone and saying, this show it's promising for all these reasons. And so you're very likely to make your money back. And as a Wharton grad, I was like, very likely to make your money back. Like, that is not a ringing endorsement for an investment opportunity, right? I was like, in fact, I thought it was kind of absurd, actually, and literally in my pool of investors, I don't have a single investor that doesn't want to make a good return, like make a pile of money, really, That being said, I also don't have a single investor that isn't passionate also about Broadway and about the work and enjoys coming to the parties and the opening nights and hopefully the Tony party and, yes, there's all of that too. But I know there are, at least when I started, 20, 21 years ago, there were a lot of those types, people who were just wealthy individuals who believed in a piece and didn't really do the due diligence on the numbers and the business. And they were okay with that because they just supported the arts, and God bless those people. But those weren't my investors. My investors were a bit of that, but also like real business people who understood how to read those projections and wanted to know that I had a plan to make their money back. I also always put my own money into my shows, which is not something that other producers always do, but I always do. And that's another thing I learned from business school. You should show them that you have your own skin in the game. And my investors often ask that, like, how much money do you have in the show? And I will be honest, like increasingly that amount is very little. And in fact, to be totally forthcoming on Jagged, I don't have any of my own money in the show, but I did. And the only reason that I don't anymore is because we were so oversubscribed. There were so many people who wanted in that I took the piece that I had invested and gave it to somebody who really wanted in because I wanted to do right by them.
The same experience on Kinky Boots. I was a co-producer on it, but so many of my investors wanted in. And I think that's something that all lead producers should do is say, or all co-producers should do, like if your investors want it, give it to them, for God's sakes.
Exactly right.
You're going to be just fine.
Exactly right. So I guess that's kind of how I approach it. I try to show both. I try to show that like I have a clear path to how this will be a commercial success because I'm a commercial producer. I love nonprofit theater, but I don't work in it. I'm a commercial producer. And I show them why I think artistically this piece is going to be great and entertaining. Because ultimately, I think that's my job. My job is twofold, equally important, to create something that's entertaining and create something that's going to make money. As a commercial producer, I have to do both.
You've got a very exciting few months ahead of you as we start the big race into the Tony Awards. How does that look to you? Are you starting to develop strategies? How early do you start thinking about that in terms of the overall marketing strategy for the show?
Yeah, I mean, we on one hand, you have to really focus on the art and not worry too much about awards. You'll hear a lot of people say that, it's not about the awards. And it's not. On the other hand, like, when do you start thinking about that? You start thinking about it from the minute you decide you're going to Broadway. On one hand, it's very, very hard to get a theater, as I'm sure everyone on your podcast at some point has talked about that. I mean, it's a very difficult time to get a theater, which is exciting. It means there's a lot of shows wanting to be on Broadway. But to some extent, you also have to think about seasons, and one of the reasons why we didn't go in the fall, like right after we had a wonderful sold out run at ART. To be honest, like we weren't getting the offers of the theater that we wanted. We wanted to be in a size roughly 1,200, which is exactly where we are right now. So there was that too, but we also were kind of looking at the landscape a little bit, and we said, would it hurt us to go in the next season from a Tony perspective? And that wasn't the reason we waited, but it was one of them. We thought about that, so I would say even way back then, even before we had a theater, it was at least coming into our conversation, to be responsible. And we ultimately decided, like, you don't pick a theater based on what the potential Tony landscape looks like. That's both silly and arrogant. But it would be irresponsible as a producer not to at least have that be one factor of your conversation. So really, it goes all the way back then. Talking more specifically now that the show is open and at this exact moment in time, we are having real, like, okay, now we need to think about Tony campaign. Like, that's happening literally right now. So I would say that's, January, like really, we got through the holidays and we opened the show on December 5th. And, as soon as we got back, one of our first agenda items on our catch-up calls were, we need to start thinking about our Tony campaign.
And were you involved in Grammy campaigns? Were you in the music industry at all?
Certainly.
So is there an element of trying to grab a Grammy that you haven't seen Broadway do that you think we might? Should we lobby more for this stuff? We are now more than, God, and when I started in this business, we never had Tony campaigns.
Sure, yeah.
But what's something we can learn from the music industry? Whether it's, frankly, we'll broaden it because I don't want you to give away your secrets to everybody.
No, that's fine.
But what's something about marketing music that we can learn from in the theater business?
Wow, that's a really good question. I mean, to me, the marketing of music is really, it's a little almost by that definition, when you say marketing music, that's a pretty broad thing to say, as opposed to saying, like, I am marketing this show, right? Like, Beyonce doesn't market. You don't think of, like, how are we going to market that one concert at Madison Square Garden? It's like, how do we market her as an entity, and her music, right? And so I think that even that kind of mindset is worth applying to Broadway. Like, don't think of this as just a show. Think of this as a piece of art. And how do you market that in every way possible? Not to sell tickets, to generate conversation, to generate the interest of other artists. Like, don't think of it as just one show in one venue where you got to sell X number of tickets. Think about that as well. You got to do that. You got to fill the theater just to return the money to your investors and start making a profit. That's Broadway Business 101. But think of it broadly as the art. I mean, that's how record labels thought about their artists. You know, a record label would sign an artist to a number of albums. You know, they would have an artist signed for 5 albums, 10 albums. So they would also think about developing careers. And that's, you know, right there a very big difference with Broadway. You know, you don't put together a creative team and then say, like, we're going to do 5 things together. The first is Jagged, and we're going to, you know, I would go walk through fire with this creative team, and I hope to work with all of them again. But it's not as though we've signed a deal where they're going to do my next 4 projects, you know. But that would be the sort of analogy in the music industry. But what that creates in the music industry is those companies think about when they're doing their jobs right, the more successful ones think about development. They think of long-term perspective. They think about what will this one marketing effort, how will it affect the immediate, but also how will it affect the long term. And I think very often we don't have that longer term perspective in the theater business, the way the music industry does.
So true. We're mostly just scrambling, trying to get to next week, frankly, with all of our shows, rather than thinking long term.
You have to do that too. I'm certainly not suggesting you have to do that in theater as well. Or you'll get kicked out of your theater. You know, like we've seen that story, right? They'll exercise the stop clause. So, you know. You
mentioned your next 4 projects. What is next for you in your strange concoction of how you put these things together?
Super, super exciting time for me. You know, as is probably evident from this conversation, I came out of the music industry. I love music. It's my first love. And I have a lot of contacts in that world. So probably unsurprisingly, I've been getting a ton of phone calls, incoming opportunities from musicians, artists, their managers, their reps, but very often it's the musicians themselves wanting to play in this space. And as they are observing that really interesting work is being done in this space. You know, it's not just, I mean, there are some great bios it's not what I do, but there are some very good ones, very successful ones, but there's also very interesting, you know, Hamilton has proved that it can do what it does on Broadway. Hedwig came to Broadway in a way that, like, when, you know, I was a gigantic fan of Hedwig at the Jane Street Theater when it ran off Broadway. Back then, you couldn't imagine it playing on Broadway. Now it, you know, wins Tonys on Broadway. You know, Broadway has proven itself as a place where, you know, anything goes, in the sense of that you can try to take anything to Broadway. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work, but like just by nature of what the show isn't like, well, that doesn't sound like a Broadway show. It's like if you develop it in a certain way, it might have a chance, right? That's not to say it's going to work. But my point there is musical artists see that. And artists that may 5-10 years ago thought, like, I'm not a Broadway guy, or gal, you know, that's cheesy jazz hands, it's not my thing, I don't write show tunes, are now thinking like, maybe there's something to do there. And so I'm getting a lot of those phone calls from artists across the musical spectrum in terms of genre, and also across, like, estates, you know, from artists that have either passed away or bands that have broken up, as well as from, you know, currently existing artists and bands who are currently composing, wanting to explore this path of doing, you know, something. And I should also take a step back and not say necessarily Broadway, but musical theater on stage. The way I describe it is live narrative entertainment. So what I do is I create live narrative entertainment based on high profile music IP. So, you know, Broadway's a sweet spot, but it might not just be Broadway. It might be a touring production to tour amphitheaters. It might be something that belongs in the UK and has a very UK sensibility. Like, who knows? You know, I certainly don't want to say that every project is bound for Broadway, but live narrative entertainment. So story, that's why I say include narrative in that. So not just cool concert experiences, but something story oriented based on high profile music IP. So what that means is what I do is I work with well-known artists or composers or their estates. Love new composers, love seeing that kind of work. It's not what I do. It's not what I do as a producer. So in that little spiel, live narrative entertainment based on high profile music IP, I have embarrassment of riches of opportunities that I'm discussing. I can't drop any names just yet, but one of two things is going to happen over the course of 2020 from me and my company. The first is that you'll hear me announce 3 or 4 of these projects that will be, as I said, a live narrative entertainment project based on an artist or a composer that you will have heard of. Or the second thing that I'm gearing up to do is I'm actually in the process of putting investment materials together and raising a little bit of money to expand my company. Literally, I'm very proud of the fact that we're lean and mean. We is me and my assistant Lenora, and I obviously have a number of partners on all the projects I work on, but my company is just me and one assistant. So I'm entirely going to raise some money. Don't know what that amount is just yet. I'm putting the financial model together with a friend of mine who works in investment banking, and I believe it's going to be somewhere in the 5 to 10 million range, entirely to hire new staff. Hire some other producers, some more support staff, a COO biz dev type person, and also have some money left over to chase music rights, and because those are expensive. And under that scenario, in which I raise a little bit of cash, then I'm announcing 8 to 10 projects by the end of the year, or 8 to 12 projects. And I should say, projects that will be staggered out. Not just because every cool artist crosses my desk does it mean that they are right for the musical theater format. Not everyone is right for it. Not every artist or album has a story built in. And I said I'm big on story. But you'll definitely be hearing either 4 projects, or you're going to be hearing around 10 projects announced in the near future. Well, no, I shouldn't say near future, over the course of the next year.
Well, I just love that you found this little niche and you just focus so intently on it. So smart. And 2, I love also that you're applying this business model of raising money for your company, which is what most companies do in the world. And Broadway producers, once again, just like we don't have graphic novels,
right,
also do not do.
Well, I'm end of January 26th, my company turns 21 years old, and up until now we've not raised any money. Like, it's not been the path that I've chosen to take, but now it's time. And that scenario under which I'm but I'm doing 3 or 4 of these projects, that would be fine from a financial standpoint, in the sense that, like, I'm doing great. I love what I do. I don't need, quote unquote, need to do that from a financial sense. But what that would result in is a scenario where I'm telling an amazing artist, sorry, can't work with you because I don't have any bandwidth. And that would be a shame. And it's funny you said, like, I found this real niche and I'm laser focused on it, and I have. And that would also be, an answer to a question you asked earlier. What's something you learned in business school? It's like, identify a niche where you have a competitive advantage and really laser focus on that. But to be totally honest, like, I can't claim that I set out to do that. Really, I found myself in that niche because I followed my passions. And then all of a sudden I found myself here. Like, my passions are unique. They're unique to me. And my path has just been unique because that's the way life took me, that I, had a lot of experience in the music industry and then a lot of experience in theater. And here I am, where those 2 industries are converging. So on one hand, I like to think that I am a sum of my parts, and yes, I'm a business student and I think along, in certain ways. But also, like, I don't want to pretend to be that smart. Like, it's also like life brought me where it brought me just by following my passions.
Well, everyone on Broadway is glad it brought you here for sure. So this is my last question, which is my genie question.
Uh-oh.
I want you to imagine that the genie from Aladdin comes to visit you and wants to grant you one wish as a thank you for bringing Alanis to Broadway and all these other artists, which are, I'm sure, going to be enormous, not only for this individual space, but just also marketing the theater in general. When people like Alanis Morissette come to Broadway, Broadway becomes very cool, which is just very good for the theater. So the genie wants to thank you for that and grant you this one wish. You're a real positive guy, and I love your optimism, and I get the smile on your face. If everyone could see it right now, you just know this guy is doing what he was meant to do.
Thank you.
What's the one thing that drives you nuts about working on Broadway, that frustrates you, that actually makes you bang the table, go, man, I wish this could be different, and the genie would wish it away?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, not unlike that question you asked me earlier. I will think about it, and maybe I'll get back to you. But really, off the top of my head, there really isn't anything like that. There isn't anything that I bang my head on the desk about. One of the things I'm really proud of is that, I have an 8-year-old and I have an 11-year-old. And, one of the things that I'm proud that I model for them is that, like, every day that I come home, I'm proud of what I do. I love what I do. Now, let me be very specific when I say that. Not every day is an easy day. Like they also see dad come home some nights and I'm tired, or I'm like, look, obviously stressed, or I'm upset because something didn't, some very specific thing, some negotiation or some whatever, some performance, something happened that didn't go the way I wanted it to go. So it's not as though I'm always like happy, but they know that like dad does what he loves. And there's nothing I regret or hate about what I do. There really isn't. So if it's a professional wish that the genie could grant, it would just be that I could do that option too. Like the genie grants me success with my my 5 to 10 million fundraise for TEG Live, and that I get to do those 10 plus projects instead of 4. Like that's my dream, and again, don't want to sound arrogant, but I don't think I'm going to need the genie for that. I think I'm going to pull that off on my own.
Yeah, I'd certainly bet on you. Based on everything you've done so far, I think you're going to do just fine with that and everything else you're doing. So thank you for being here today. Thank you, all of you, for listening out there. We will see you next time on the Producer's Perspective podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks again to Vivek for sitting down with us today. Listen, if you're excited about our new season on the Producer's Perspective podcast, please do us a favor. Review us on Apple Podcast or whatever platform you are listening to us on. It just helps other theater makers and theater fans like you enjoy these conversations and find these conversations, and just helps get the word out about theater all over the world. And if you're looking for more theater podcasts, check out Broadway Podcast Network. This thing has so many podcasts on it now. It's amazing. It's a brand new community and platform for Broadway themed podcasts and other online content. And there's some really cool people on there. Carrie Butler's on there, all sorts of great, amazing folks that you can listen to. To find more about me and learn about my projects and everything I'm doing, you can follow me on Instagram. It's at Ken Davenport Bway, or check out my blog at theproducersperspective.com. And now this week's hashtag songwriter of the week is Drew Gasparini. Check out his song, If I Had You, from his hit album, I Could Use a Drink. There is a great title for an album. For more information, check out drewgasparini.com or at Drew Gasparini on Instagram and Twitter. And we will see you next week with a brand new episode of the Producer's Perspective podcast.